Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the 11th webinar in the Linked Early Modern Drama online training series. This webinar is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This is our October editorial webinar. Today we'll have both me and James Mardock speaking, so we'll introduce ourselves. I'm Janelle Jenstad. I am a professor of English at the University of Victoria, the conceptor and director of LEMDO, also co-coordinating editor of Digital Renaissance Editions, the Moemel Mayoral Shows Anthology, and the new Internet Shakespeare Editions. And I'm also the editor of the NISE Merchant of Venice and of Mom's Crusoe Thriambos. James, I'll pass to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm James Mardock. I'm a professor at the University of Nevada. I've been the some form of general editor on the ISE and NISE for a lot of years. I am one of the co-coordinating editors of the DRE, and I edited Henry V.
Thanks, James. At the University of Victoria, we like to begin in a good way by acknowledging the land on which LEMDO is built. So we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wet'suwet'en peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. If you too are on Indigenous territories and you want to put an acknowledgement in the chat, please feel free to do so. So our plan for today is to highlight the new Digital Renaissance Editions editorial guidelines, which also apply to the new Internet Shakespeare editions, as well as LEMDO's extensive resources on modernization. We won't be able to talk about every aspect of those resources, but I've pulled out some highlights, and our main goal is to make sure that you're aware that those resources exist and that you know what to do when those resources don't cover specific questions that you have. Most of the examples today come from James's edition of Henry V, and he will be able to speak to his thought process and the decisions that he ended up making and on what grounds he made those decisions. We also have some very experienced editors here, Jesus Tronk, David Swain. If you want to jump in and share your wisdom, we'd certainly welcome your input as well. We also have people who are just beginning the editorial process, so I hope that we can kind of balance out the expertise in the room and mobilize that to help the people who are just starting their work. So our learning outcomes for today is that you will know what modernization is. You will know where to look for answers and examples. You will know a few of the key recurring issues in modernization, and you will know how one editor, James, handled some challenging points in Henry V. You're welcome to ask questions or make comments at any point as we go, and we'll also save some time at the end for questions as well. Okay, so usually we end the webinar with resources. I'm starting with resources today because it is one of our learning outcomes to make you aware of all this. The DRE editorial guidelines will be formally published, we hope, by the end of 2024 with the first release of the Digital Renaissance Editions website. We can give you the URL. We won't publicize the URL because it's a beta site. But if you want it, you can write to us for it. So I just want to go through, really quickly what's in there. So Unit 4 is entirely about emendation and modernization, and we've divided it up into a number of chapters. Chapter 5 covers what is emendation. Chapter 6 covers modernization of spelling and usage. Chapter 7 covers modernization of punctuation. And those are the 3 chapters that I'm drawing from for the webinar today. Act and scene divisions, stage directions, speech prefix, and character lists we will cover in future webinars. And modernization of lineation we'll try to tuck in somewhere later in the year, but we can also talk about it a bit today if we have time. The LEMDO encoding guidelines also have a chapter on modern texts, and that URL we can make public already. So it is specifically about how to encode these things. Sometimes it makes sense to do the encoding and the decision making at the same time. In other cases, it might make more sense for you to think about the modernization and the encoding separately. Okay, so just a reminder about workflow. You have some options. You can collate first and then modernize. You can modernize first and then collate, or you can do both at the same time. And in our last webinar, we talked about some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of those workflows. You will figure out fairly quickly what works for you and your text. Sometimes the answer depends on how well studied your text is and how many texts you might have to take into account in your collation. Regardless of order of operations, what you're doing when you're modernizing is establishing your text, and that is the main work of your edition. For non-canonical plays, you might be the first person ever to establish a modern text, so your edition is going to have a lot of weight in the tradition. We hope it will become a tradition and that your edition will be the first of a number of editions. So let's move on to some basic definitions. What is modernization? This is how the DRE guidelines define it. Modernization is a mass emendation of the copy text according to a set of principles. Most of those emendations will not have to be collated. Some of them will have to be collated. So we'll talk about the basic emendations, the sorts of things that you don't have to collate. But in this case, you can mostly follow the guidelines. So compositorial spellings. We're all accustomed to looking at early modern texts, and we recognize that there are a wide range of spellings. Many of those spellings can be silently emended with no need to collate whatsoever. So things like the interchangeable UV, if it's clear what the meaning is and there's no doubt about what it should be, you can silently modernize and you do not have to collate. A lot of words are given a terminal E, sometimes to fill up the compositorial line. That terminal E, if it's not required in modern English, can be silently dropped. This example has two changes. A lot of substantives are capitalized in early modern compositorial practice, and a lot of words that end in Y in modern spelling will end in IE in early modern spelling. You can silently correct the IE to modern spelling, and you can silently use lowercase for those nouns. The double L in many cases can just be silently changed to a single L. And also the interchangeable I and J can be silently modernized if there's no ambiguity. You don't always want to completely modernize the text and put it into perfect modern English. Sometimes the text is signaling something about character. So James, this would probably be a good point for you to jump in because you had to deal with this a lot in Henry V. You want to retain any character idiolects, any accents or tics. So James, we talked about how the objective is to make these legible to the modern reader. Do you want to say a bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean it's pretty straightforward. In the case of Llewellyn here, there are inconsistencies in his ticks. I did not decide that it was my job to change every B to an unvoiced P, as you see in Brave. So I'm with generally I you can stick to the way that the authoritative text that you're working from has rendered the ticks. Um, with the case of Captain Jamie in Henry V, there are modernized Scots alternative spellings to some of the words that he uses. So, for example, GUD for good is how Shakespeare renders the Scots pronunciation. If they're in that case, which is not going to come up for virtually anyone else, but in that case, I did modernize to GUID because that is the way that the Scots word good is spelled. But in most cases, with a tick like Llewellyn's, you can, or an idiolect, you can modernize just what you can retain what the original text has, and there's not a there's not a mandate to try to make that character consistent. If sometimes Llewellyn's the word world in a Llewellyn speech will be spelled WORELD, and sometimes it'll be spelled the modern way, WORLD. And I didn't try to don't impose ticks on characters if they're not represented, if they're not represented in the copy text.
Okay, great. Thanks, James. Foreign languages. So this is kind of a tricky one because a lot of playwrights actually don't know how to represent the language that they've put in their text. So you have to make a decision about whether it's meant to be gibberish as the Dutch is in the Shoemaker's Holiday, or if you need to render it in the correct modern standard form of that language. So there's a fair bit of French in Henry V. So James has had to correct the spelling there and use the accents that would be in normal French here. I think that's a fairly straightforward example.
Yeah, it's fairly nightmarish though with the French, because you have to make a determination of whether um this the difference in your between your copy text and modern French is the evolution of French over 400 years, whether it is just a just a spelling, or whether it is the playwright or the compositor's bad French. Um, and in most cases, you can find a good modern equivalent that doesn't make the French gibberish. There are some places where modernization, and this happens in English too, but modernization of French will destroy a bilingual verb, and you just have to make a decision, or not a bilingual verb, a bilingual pun. You'll just have to make a decision about whether to uh, retain the bad French to maintain the pun. In most cases, I chose to modernize the French and write an annotation explaining that this seems to be intended as a pun. For example, the French word bras is heard by ancient pistol at one point in Henry V as the English word brass. There is just not any way to make a solid determination about whether Shakespeare thought the word was pronounced that way, whether he'd heard a French speaker pronounce the word that way, or what. So at some point you kind of just have to stick to your rationale and then explain the problem in a footnote.
And we do have a pretty significant body of linguistic expertise in our general editorial group. So we have first language French speakers, we have first language Spanish speakers, we have experts in Latin, Dutch. So if you're wrestling with a play that has any of those languages, we can connect you with an editor who could help you. Okay, What you cannot do is change the case of any of the words. So I often bring up this particular example in my editing classes. This is from the end of The Jew of Malta, where Barabbas is swirling around in the cauldron and cursing everybody. The text actually says damned Christians, comma, dogs, and Turkish infidels in the text. Christians is a noun. You cannot change Christians from a noun to an adjective, which at least one edition has done, and it really changes the meaning of the text in a play where race relations matter quite a bit. So you cannot change the case form of the work that you're working with. Variant spellings versus variant forms are interesting, and there's quite a bit of criticism written on this. And I know James has some thoughts on this. The key question you have to ask is whether or not the copy text is offering a variant spelling or a variant form. If it's a variant spelling, then you would use the modern authority spelling in the Oxford English Dictionary headword. If it's a variant form, then you want to retain the form. So here are some examples. Turbant is a variant spelling of turban, and you can determine that by looking at the Oxford English Dictionary. So you would modernize to turban. On the other hand, handkerchief is a variant form of handkerchief, and so you would want to keep handkerchief. You don't want to emend so much that the flavor of the text is lost, and some of the interesting variant forms are flattened out into standard English. Names of real places. Generally, you want to follow an authority name for the place. So some common sources for authority spellings. For London place names, we use the authority spelling as set out in the Map of Early Modern London, which assigns every place an authority name based on the name that's most common in 1600, so right in the middle of our period. For other places, you can look at Shugden's Topographical Dictionary to the Works of Shakespeare, which is a really handy resource. And we have digitized that and OCR'd it so that you can search it if you want. If you're interested in having that, just email me, lemdo@uvic.ca, and I can send you that. One interesting exception that was not an uncontroversial change was the Forest of Arden and As You Like It. One edition at least has modernized it to Ardennes, which is the name of the forest in France. And maybe James, you have some thoughts on that sort of change.
Yeah, this is a okay. So there's a few things. Did you want me to talk about my cursorary example?
I've got slides for that later.
You got it later. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So yeah, the place, sometimes it's really obvious what you do. For example, the city of Harfleur, where the English land in Henry V is invariably spelled Harflew, just a phonetic approximation. You can modernize that to Harfleur, no problem. There are other examples where changing the place name might lead to metrical difficulty. For example, the city of Rouen, which has something like a bisyllable in English, is always spelled as a monosyllable in Shakespeare, Roan, like the horse color. And that wobbles your meter a little bit. You might want to think about that, or at least put an annotation in that indicates that originally this is a monosyllable. There's another point in Henry V where the Duke of Exeter, who doesn't seem to care too terribly much about his precise French, refers to the Louvre, the palace that eventually becomes the museum. But the folio text spells it Louer, or lover. There's an extended bit of wordplay on lover and Louvre that doesn't work if you pronounce the place name Louvre. So again, you need an extended annotation if you're going to make that change. But I would suggest that you try for consistency. So oh God, I guess by my rationale, I would probably modernize Arden to Ardennes, but oh, I hate doing that. So other another rationale that you might take is that with the Forest of Arden, and I know no one here is editing as you like it, but it's a little it is a sort of general idea. You can think about names that are fictional versus names that are actual places. This works with people too, right? So for example, in every case in Henry V where we were talking about an actual historical person, I modernized, and in some cases that led to wobbling of meter, and I had to really agonize about it and put in a lengthy footnote. In the case of Fluellen, for example, which is obviously a phonetic spelling of the Welsh surname Llewellyn. And some editors do modernize to Andrew Gurr modernized to double Lew, the actual Welsh spelling of that surname. I chose not to do so and to retain the Shakespearean spelling on the rationale that Llewellyn is not a historical character. He's a fictional character who is best known to readers by that name. If it had been an actual person, like if there was a historical Captain Gareth Llewellyn or something, or Llewellyn, I would have modernized that. But yeah, these again, these are issues that you can worry about at some length, but eventually you have to draw a line and say, here's what my rationale is, and I will stick to my rationale and explain any problems that causes.
Yeah, I've got a few slides later where you get to really dig deep into those kinds of problems. Yeah, with the Forest of Arden in As You Like It, there's such a strong weight of tradition leaning towards Arden, and we know that Shakespeare's mother was Mary Arden, so there's that family connection as well. You know, he may have meant Arden, not Ardennes. Plus, the meter changes if you go with the French spelling and pronunciation. So there are these other factors we have to take into account: the editorial tradition, maybe extra textual factors, in addition to the principles that we're trying to follow. So let's talk about contractions and elisions, to apostrophe or not to apostrophe. First question to ask, are we talking about a modal verb situation? And I'm going to explain what a modal verb is, because not everybody would know that these days. Is there an audible E in the suffix, or is the E silent? On these matters, editorial guidelines will always tell you what to do, and the answers won't be the same from one series to another. So a modal verb is a verb that's used with another verb to express possibility, necessity, permission. These are all, little verbs that we use all the time: can, could, did, may, shall, should, ought to, will, would. So they come up in early modern texts, most often in the second person familiar form: thou canst, couldst, didst, hadst, mayst. Our practice at DRE is to not put an apostrophe in there. They're not contractions. They're just a conjugated verb. If an E is pronounced, we retain the E and there's no apostrophe. So thou liest, as Ariel says in The Tempest, trying to confuse people. On the other hand, if the E is silent, usually for metrical reasons, so lived, sayst, watry, you would drop the E in the word and insert an apostrophe to indicate to the reader that it's just a single syllable word, or 2 syllables for watry rather than 3 syllables for watery. We have lists in the guidelines. We have lists of how to handle various elisions, contractions, and oaths, slid for God's lid, eyelid. So you can just look at those. You don't need to think too much. You just follow the guidelines. Okay, capitalization. There are a lot of emphasis capitals in early modern English, so substantives, nouns, in particular, have a capital letter. You can mostly remove those. There are some difficult cases where you have to think about whether or not that capitalized noun is actually meant to indicate a place, or an abstract concept or an idea, love. Do you retain that? You would have to justify a retention. Titles versus roles. Every editorial series will make a judgment call about this. And this is the judgment call that we've made. So we remove all emphasis capitals. We capitalize titles. So we capitalize King Henry, we capitalize Duke of Gloucester, but we don't capitalize roles. So the king, the duke, my lord. If a character is speaking to someone and says my lord or my lady, it's still lowercase. Okay, and institutions versus buildings. We capitalize institutions like the church, but we wouldn't capitalize generic buildings. So robbing a church. Our decision on how to handle the names of gods. We capitalize the names of gods, Diana, Jupiter. We capitalize God if it's the Christian God, because that is the name of the Christian God. However, we use lowercase pronouns for God. So he, him, his, thou, thee, thy. The quotations here are from Henry's prayer before the battle, I think. Yet forgive me, God. That's the proper name of God. And Henry is speaking to God, that I do brag thus. Then he asks this question, what kind of God art thou? God in this case is not a name, and the pronoun thou should not be capitalized. Okay, so here's an example where James has had to wrestle with a number of different capitalizations. If he be not fought withal, my lord, let us not live in France. Let us quit all and give our vineyards to a barbarous people. So following the rules, James has turned my lord, the capital in my lord, to the lowercase. France is a proper name, so it keeps its capitalization. Vineyards and people are emphasis capitals applied to substantives, so they become lowercase. Okay, O and O. This is a tricky one for new editors. So if it's the vocative O, we standardize on the letter O, and you will have to figure this out when you're working with your text, because O with it, what we spell with just an O is sometimes spelled OH in early modern text. So the vocative O invokes a person, a thing, or a god, and sometimes it's just implied rather than spelled out. So O for a muse of fire is the vocative O because the chorus is invoking something. O viper vile, O hound of Crete. These are all from Henry V. James, did you want to jump in with context?
No, except to say we do wrestle with these sometimes because the interjection OH can frequently, happen in the same emotional context as the vocative O. So if you can say there's someone implicitly or explicitly addressed, then the vocative O is the place to go. And if not, then it's probably an interjection.
Okay, so these are some interjections from James's text. And I puzzled over these. I was trying to work through what I thought James's thought process might be. Oh, let their bodies follow, my dear liege. Oh, guilt indeed. Oh, well a day, lady, if he be not hewn now, we shall see wilful adultery and murder committed. Oh, let us yet be merciful. So those seem to be interjections. Sometimes in verse, they're there to make up the meter, and you definitely shouldn't be changing them to the vocative O. Punctuation. Two helpful things to remember. The punctuation in early modern printed text is not necessarily authorial. We don't know where it came from. We don't know if it comes from a manuscript that was copied out by a scribe. Ralph Crane is notorious, for example, for adding a lot of punctuation that would not have been Shakespearean. And of course, compositors have the freedom to repunctuate or to omit punctuation if they need to try to fit a longish line into the space they have. A second thing to remember is that whether the punctuation is authorial or scribal or compositorial, it has two different functions in the early modern period. It's meant to be a guide to the voice as well as a guide to the sense. Some of you will know Richard Mulcaster's Elementary from 1582. This table comes from the Moemal Merrill Show's editorial guidelines, where I've turned Mulcaster's prose into a table. And this is Mulcaster describing the functions of punctuation. So the comma, he says, in writing, follow with some small branch of the sentence. So he's talking about how the comma is a guide to the sense there. It's marking off a little branch or a digression in the sentence, functioning exactly the way the pair of commas functions now. But in reading, it warneth us to rest there and to help our breath a little. So once you factor that into the equation, that the comma might be there to indicate how to read the text out loud, then you can start to recognize that there may be commas in there that you can omit because they don't help with the sense. They're there to help with the reading. A colon in writing follow with some full branch or half the sentence, which is exactly how we use the colon now. Mulcaster doesn't say, at least in this passage, what we're supposed to do when we encounter a colon when we're reading out loud. The period, he says, in writing, follow with a perfect sentence, so a complete independent clause. In reading out loud, it warneth us to rest there and to help our breath at full. So the principles we need to follow, we need to modernize the punctuation for the modern reader. So the first principle is that we follow modern grammar rules. Unless the grammar is meant to be confused. So a famous passage is in the final scene of A Midsummer Night's Dream in the play that the Rude Mechanicals put on. They don't stand upon points, so that they're not actually pausing in the places that Mulcaster would have them pause in order to indicate that a unit of sense has been concluded. And so the speech is deliberately wrongly pointed so that we can understand how these amateur actors are misunderstanding, misconstruing the clauses in the speech. So if that's the case, you don't want to modernize the grammar in that case by modernizing the punctuation. The second principle is that you want to make the best sense of the passage in the light of the rest of your text. So that's an extensible principle. Anything you do at any point in the text has to function coordinately with all of the rest of the text. So no decision ever gets made in complete isolation from the rest of the decisions that you're making all along. So a couple of pointers: do not overuse exclamation marks. The DRE editorial guidelines point out that it's really easy to start directing the play. Inserting exclamation marks suggests that the actor should deliver the line in a certain kind of way. So you don't want to start directing the play by adding punctuation that's meant to encourage the actor to go in a particular direction. On the other hand, yeah, James.
Likewise, unless you are Gary Taylor, please refrain from emphasis italics. And maybe
Good.
even if you are Gary Taylor.
Thank you, James. I very much doubt he'll watch this webinar, but you never know. There are genuine instances of the rhetorical device of exclamatio. And so in those cases, yes, you can put in an exclamation mark. So this is Catherine trying to remember her language lesson. Fo, le foot et le kunt. Those are not complete utterances. So even though the exclamation marks are not there in the folio source text, James has put them in for the modern reader to see that they are examples of exclamatio. M dashes, again, this is something that's specific to a series. Series will decide how to handle these particular cases. We have decided to use M dashes to indicate a change of addressee within a speech. So in this case, Henry is talking to his brother. He interrupts the speech to give an order to the soldiers, march to the bridge. So march to the bridge is offset from the rest of the speech with long dashes. It's your call, made in conjunction with your anthology lead, whether or not you spell out who is the recipient of the interpolated address. One thing to note is that there are no spaces on either side of the M dash. Another case where we use M dashes is to indicate unfinished or interrupted sentences. So Fluellen is interrupted by McMorris in the scene where the captains are arguing. So Fluellen hasn't been able to finish his thought. There is not many of your nation, of my nation. What is my nation? All right. So there are answers to those questions and more in the DRE editorial guidelines. It's worth zooming out and thinking about the big picture questions that should be guiding us while we're modernizing. And the big guiding question is, what are you editing towards? We talked about this question and its companion question, who are you editing for, in an earlier webinar. So I'm going to hand over to James to talk about what he was editing towards in his edition of Henry V.
Yeah, so I made the decision really early on to edit the first quarto and the first folio separately as different snapshots of an evolving play in two different points in time, which meant that a lot of my editorial rationale was based on my decision not to conflate those two texts. So my guiding principle was, if there's any way to make the copy text that I'm working from make sense, then I will retain that. I will retain the copy text reading. If not, if it's really clearly an error, then I will amend. I will fix it. There were a couple of places where that rationale had to be imported and heavily enforced by myself. For example, there's a point in the folio where Henry compares levity and cruelty. The word levity is spelled Leuity, and it's almost always been corrected or amended to lenity, because lenity seems like the opposite of cruelty. But and it could very well be a flipped UN error. But in that case, I said, look, levity also works as an antonym for cruelty, especially in the sense of lightness. Um, you can have a cruel blow and a light blow. And also, we are talking about a king who is going to play a practical joke in between counting the dead bodies. So levity is not an unapt adjective for him. So I did have an extensive annotation explaining that lenity is also a possible reading, but I decided to maintain levity because of what I was editing towards, which was a snapshot of the play in 1623, or whenever the text that underlies the folio was produced.
Yeah. Thanks, James. So when in doubt, there will be cases where the guidelines will not answer your questions. So we've got 6 steps in this decision tree. Step 1, what am I editing towards? What does my answer call for in this situation? And that's exactly what James was doing with lenity and levity, right? The temptation to follow editorial tradition was undoubtedly really strong, but you stuck to your principles. If there's no clear answer from that first question, then you can ask, is there a rationale for changing what's in my copy text? And we have some examples coming up where James will be able to talk about his rationale for that. If you don't have an answer to that question, you can talk to your anthology lead, and they will think it through with you. If there's still no resolution after that, if there are 2 options that seem equally good and equally defensible, and both of them are in keeping with your stated editorial principle, you still have to make a decision. We're not, even though we are producing digital editions, we are not producing editions that have animated features that allow you to have your cake and eat it too. You have to make a decision. It's one or the other. So try to make that decision so that it's consistent with other decisions that you've made in other parts of the edition. After that, remember that you can always retain the original reading of your copy text. In James's case, he was producing a modern edition of the folio. So at the end of the day, it was always an option to retain the folio reading. Whatever you do, you put it all in an annotation and discuss it so that readers and teachers and actors and directors can understand what the options were and your thinking process in settling on what you eventually settled on. Okay, so now, James, this is your opportunity to talk through some of the problems that you had in your text. So here is your cursorily problem.
So what do you do with cursorily? Cursorily is not a word. The French king says, I have but with a cursorily eye or glance the articles. What he means is he's run his eye over the articles. And since let's see, I think since Hanmer, we editors have said, yeah, there we go. Since Hanmer editors have said we can, like the modern word is cursory, so just change it to cursory. The problem with that is it's a verse line, right? We have, but with a cursory eye or glance the articles, it requires a tetrasyllable. The folio has cursolary, the first quarto has cursonary, the third quarto has cursorary. What this indicates is that the 17th century did not have hadn't settled yet on an English adjective for the Latin word, curso, to run. So what do you do with this? Dover Wilson decided to make it cursatory, which, like cursilary, is not a word that we use today. It is attested in the OED, but it's not attested in the 17th century. It's not a 17th century version of this word. So what do we do? Is it a variant spelling of cursory? I decided no. Should we use a 4-syllable word that wasn't available to Shakespeare and his contemporaries? Well, probably not. So I just retained cursilary, and said that's this is what it means. Today we would say cursory, but the meter requires 4 syllables. There's no reason to change it to something that isn't attested in any authoritative sense. I don't know what I would do with a word like frenzy, which appears, as we probably know, twice within 10 lines in Measure for Measure, and no one can agree on what it could possibly mean. It sometimes gets amended to precise or to there are other options for it. I have theories about it that I can talk to you. I can tell you. I can talk about Prenzy for an hour or so over drink sometime if you want to. But one of the options is, and Nigel Bockhut, among other editors of Measure for Measure, just said, we're just going to keep Prenzy. We're just going to keep it Prenzy and say nobody knows what this means. But clearly, clearly, Claudio knows what it means because he and Isabel know what it means. So that's fine. Whatever it means, it's what Angelo is. Angelo's Prenzy. Again, the final step is always write an annotation that discusses the issue. And yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Since the modern alternative recommends itself, this edition retains the original forms. That's much better said. Thanks. Whoever wrote that is smarter than me.
Yeah. Can thank your past self. So there you are saying, you know what? I'm just going to give the folio form because that is always an option. Okay, here's your louver pun.
Yeah, this is just heartbreaking, right? Because you don't necessarily know what to do with this. It's obviously the Louvre that he's talking about, and the modernization takes the pun away, right? He'll make your Paris lover shake for it. We're at the mistress court of mighty Europe. We've got a pun on a place that's metaphorically becoming a female lover, a Louvre. It's not gonna work in performance. Um, in most cases. Although if you are Brian Blessed and you have access to a good annotation that says it's Louvre, but originally it was lover, and Exeter is making a joke here, then you will take your big Brian Blessed chutzpah and push it through on stage. And that's great. You want to give actors the opportunity to be able to do that. But it would betray the reader to keep it lover, because then there would be just absolute confusion and require everyone to go to the annotation and say, oh, he means Louvre. Why didn't he just say Louvre? So yeah, this is one of those examples where making the choice to modernize place names has its drawbacks. But again, you can go to the annotation. I hope my annotation is good on that. Yeah, there we go.
Yep. Palace in Paris, pun on lover.
Yeah, again, my past self is a much better writer than me. Okay.
Okay. Historical names. You had some tough decisions to make. Henry V is full of the names of real people.
Yeah.
Sometimes in list form.
Yeah. So this guy, the Constable of France, who's a great character, is an actual person, Charles d'Albret. How did I modernize this? So Holinshead, Shakespeare's source, calls him Delabreth, which would have been an option. I could have just kept it as Delabreth. In this line, it requires a 3-syllable word. And the modern version of this historical figure is d'Albret, a two-syllable word. So what did I do in my modernization? Is that my
Charles Dalberet.
okay? So I I found a I found an older form of d'Albret that has a an extra syllable in there that is used by some modern historians, even though it's not used most of them, and I put it in there again with collation and annotation. And I'm sure that all of my readers are rolling their eyes that I spent any time agonizing this at all over this at all, but um, that is what we do.
We do get invested in our own editions. Okay, so there's the collation and there's the annotation. What I wanted to flag here is that James has said, as with all historical figures, I use the modern spelling. So having established a practice with the rest of the text, James is following that practice here as well. So as I said, every decision has to be made in concert with all of the other decisions that you make in modernizing. Okay, here is a problem that has to be solved. The emperor is coming in behalf of France to order peace between them, and omit. So James, talk us through it.
This okay, so this is one of my favorites because this is one of the only times that I got to say this edition is doing something completely different, or at least I thought I had. Um, this is a crux in Henry V that has that some editors have believe indicates a missing line. If you're T.W. Craik, you put in square brackets and put in a missing line, right? That you an invisible line. If you're Gary Taylor, you just write your own line and put it in, uh, right? Or Capel did that too. So it's not just that. I couldn't bring myself to write a new line and pass it off as Shakespeare's, but I did look at 17th century orthography and handwriting, and yeah, okay. And figure, oh wow, this is great. Um yeah, there are any number of editorial fixes here, but I said, what if the and was a compositor misreading we? And if you look at secretary hand, that's a really easy error to make. The D's often look like E's, and an can very easily a W can very easily look like an. I sent this to my colleague Eric Rasmussen and said, I think I found something. I'm doing something completely new. I think I fixed a crux, and he somehow knew this obscure 19th century edition by somebody called Singer that I hadn't even collated until he brought it up and said, yeah, but you're not being new, and took the wind out of my sails. But Singer did not add the rationale for it. It's a pretty elegant solution, and I stand by it because it makes what is otherwise two broken non-clauses into one good sentence. That's not really about modernization of spelling, but thanks for giving me the opportunity.
um, okay, and there's a punctuation problem. I'm going to skip over that because we want to save 5 minutes for questions.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, James. So just to recap, you've learned that modernization is a mass emendation of a copy text. You've learned to turn to the DRE editorial guidelines, Unit 4, and the LEMDO encoding guidelines, Chapter 15. You've learned about a few key recurring issues in modernization: compositorial spelling, idiolects, foreign languages, proper names, capitalization, and other issues. And you've also learned how one editor, James, handled some challenging points in Henry V. We'll just open up the floor for 5 minutes for questions or comments. It'd be especially interesting to hear from people who, are well into the weeds of their edition and have encountered some odd, interesting things themselves. Aaron Kelly. Aaron, go ahead.
Hello, and I'm working from home today, so that's why I had my camera off. So apologize for my appearance. Um, I am asking a question that I has to do with whether or not consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. So if one chooses to or sees the need to retain a non-standard spelling, a peculiar form to, in my case, I'm finding a lot of examples where I think that's going to be necessary to preserve rhyme in sections that are in rhyming couplets. But if I do that for a word within a passage, but the word appears elsewhere in the passage, but not in a place where it's rhyme, does it make sense to keep the non-standard form, non-standard spelling consistent throughout the passage, or God forbid, consistent throughout the entire text? Or is it acceptable to make it weird in the one place where the rhyme needs it and have a note that says, I've retained the archaic spelling form here to preserve blah, 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 blah. Did
That's
that
a
question
great
make sense?
question. Absolutely. And it gets us into the weeds of original pronunciation in lots of ways. For example, right, I don't know what example you're thinking of, but right, it's either Puck or Oberon who has a long speech where every word rhymes in the original pronunciation. Right? It's I and remedy and these things just don't rhyme now. So you could, in that case, spell remedy remedi, right? But then you're getting yourself into the weeds, right? And then every word that ends with what is now an e sound that was then an a sound, you're gonna have to you're gonna have to change. In a case like that, I would just have a lengthy annotation that says that points to David Crystal and his work on original pronunciation and says, as scholars have pointed out, this is a all right. This was originally a rhyme, but what is the case that you're thinking of?
Oh, I mean, this is not a Shakespeare case, which is part of what makes it funky. So I'm working on it's an earlier Tudor play. It's Godly Queen Hester, and so just in that sense, there's long swaths of it that are either rhyme royal or that are rhyming couplets, and because of that, you'll wind up with like chunks of lines that are supposed to rhyme. And when you look at the original spelling, it's clear that these words are going to rhyme. And when you change it to, or in some cases also where you might get a dumb example, where there seems to be part of what's going on with the word is also that it's a pun on one of the characters' names. And that works if you retain the original spelling. But if you change it to a perfectly standard OED, this is what the head word says, it doesn't work anymore.
This has taken us right to the fundamentals of why do we modernize at all, right?
Mm.
And you know, there have been centuries of debates over this. How early do you have to go with a text before the language has changed so much that it no longer makes sense to modernize because you're obscuring or deleting so much, non-grammatical wordplay, or extra grammatical wordplay. Um, yeah, we're not gonna, thank God nobody's editing the Fairy Queen for this, because then we'd have to have the extensive conversation about why the hell don't modern editions modernize the Fairy Queen. Um, I don't know. Does anybody want to weigh in on this? Like, how is there a line? Is there some percent? If we modernize, we're going to lose 40% of the puns. So what do we do? And if we annotate everything, then the annotation will be more than the actual text.
I think there may be times when characters deliberately take advantage of various pronunciations and deliberately badly rhyme. I'm thinking of Rosaline, Rosalind, and Rosalindy. I mean, there are times when on stage, as in country music, for example, words are deliberately mispronounced in order to make the rhyme, and we permit it. So I think there's no reason you cannot, in a note or even perhaps in the modernization, point that out.
Yeah.
I think remedy was probably pronounced mostly remedy, but if he wanted to say remedy, he could, especially if it's by a throwback character to an earlier period, like a Puck character.
Yeah, that is a possibility. The other possibility is that everyone had those rhymes, you know, like loathed and proved, right? If everybody just heard those as a rhyme, then nobody's going to say, ah, that character is making a pointed different pronunciation. You also don't want to give readers the impression that a character is messing with rhyme if that's not the case.
Yeah.
I had an example as well. It doesn't specifically deal with rhyme, although some rhymes are victim in the modernization attempt in the third quarto of the interlude that I'm doing, Jack Juggler. The first quarter and the second quarter are very, very close, but Jack Juggler third quarto is a clear attempt at modernizing it for readers. And it's a really good example from the early modern period of some of the ways in which modernization can lead us astray, because either the compositor or somebody edits the play and tries to kind of unpack some of the obscurities, but also tries to unpack some of the typographical issues that occurred in quarter one and create some howlers, and also loses some of the sense. I actually tested quarter one with my students, brand students who had never read any early modern text. I gave them the original spelling. We did a scene from the middle of it, and we just did a little kind of like table reading of it. By about 150 lines in, the whole table was just calling out readings because they were reading ahead. And by the time we got to the very end of it, this is a text with virtually no punctuation, horrendously inconsistent spelling. They were reading along very smoothly. And so I think there are good arguments for very, very light touches, particularly on some of the mid-Tudor stuff. Anyway, just wanted to give you a little bit of that pre-canonical stuff. I think
David, I now want to like you and I should just like have a comment. I'm like very excited
I know
about what you're
Godly Queen is got to have some of the same issues going on.
Exactly. You're singing my song.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
I'll just jump in to say that if you want to try things with your students, we can put your non-peer reviewed, non-finished text into our LEMDO classroom, and then your students can read it from the screen. They can try things out. And they can feel like they're participating in the editorial process too. So we've actually got Aaron's edition in the LEMDO classroom right now because King Edward School is performing her text this year, which is kind of fun. Thank you for jumping in, everyone. So it's 9:04. We're past our hour and people are starting to drift out. So I'm going to suggest that we stop the recording right now. Navarra and I have to go off to another meeting. James, you are co-host, so you could stay on and chat with others if you want to. And if you are able to.
I do have to be at another meeting soon, but
Okay.
Thank you for everything. And I'm welcome. You're welcome, more than welcome to send me an email and set up an appointment to chat at any point about these things. I love to be a nerd about things like this.
Great. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. Thank you for sharing your experience with us, James. And thank you to those of you who jumped in to share your experiences. It's been great. Have a good day, everyone.